Welcome to AfriMind. Today we're having a conversation with Dr. Julius Agbo. He's an economist and he's also a research fellow at the Brookings Institution, which is a think tank based in Washington, D.C. Dr. Julius has done a lot of work on colonialism and the impact of colonialism of African economies. So we're going to talk a lot about that. And then we're going to move back to his country, Cameroon, and talk about the economic situation in Cameroon. And then finally, we're going to end with a conversation on the future of the CFA franc. So thank you once again and welcome to the conversation. Thank you very much for being with us today, Julius.
It's my pleasure.
So you've done a lot of research on colonialism and the impact of colonialism on African economies. So I guess the question I have is what have you found? Let's start with that.
So thank you once more for the privilege to speak on this program. My research endeavor has been around understanding the long-term determinants of economic growth, how institutions evolve over time, what determines them. And I guess a crucial factor comes in, which becomes the heritage of colonialism, because the colonial structures have persisted today. There's a lot of evidence that persisted up to date. So,
can you give some examples?
The languages, for example. Most of the African countries have come to use the languages of the colonial masters. They have used the legal regimes put in place by the colonial masters. The Anglo-Saxon countries follow the common law, while the French-speaking former French colonies follow the French civil law.
So if you can give some tangible sort of specific examples.
For example, in my project, I brought the role of human capital. The way the colonial powers administered education was significantly different. The British had a more pragmatic educational system that did not alienate Africans from their traditional societies. In that sense, we come to understand why the post-colonial elite that governed former British colonies were, in a sense, more nationalistic than the post-colonial elite that governed the former French colonies, where the pattern of education administered during the colonial times, in the former French colonies, tended to isolate the elite from their country, from their own countrymen. It taught them to think more in terms of idealism. They became more Frenchified, and up to date it's difficult to get real nationalism in the French former colonies. And this, I trace it to be the causes, some of the offsprings, the offshoots of coloniality, the colonial heritage.
So I guess, so the next question leading up to that is, so now we know almost to some extent some of the factors that brought us here today. What about tomorrow? What are the policy implications of researching about the...
So basically, by knowing that now, for example, in the French-speaking former colonies in Africa, which are mainly struggling with issues of social capital, they have difficulty. Collective action is difficult in those countries, even when they are struggling in front of situations that they do not agree with, but it's difficult for them to rally people all together around a common cause. So now that we know the source of this, the implication for that would be that they will need to embrace different systems of education, maybe reform their educational programs to allow people to learn things that matter for them. Instead of post-secondary students in French-speaking countries studying the French philosophers and the Greek philosophers of age, this time they start studying about the ancestors, what they did, who were the great men of their societies. This is what I found strange, that in the French-speaking region, they never taught us Cameroon history. We learned all about British history, European history, and we never learned about Cameroon history, which is again an offshoot of the French system of education, which tended only to teach people about things that are abstract to them. An important policy implication is that they will need to reform, especially in countries that are struggling with collective action problems, or the difficulty in building social capital. Education the educational system may be part of the problem. How do you reform the educational system to train people to learn to be one another, to learn to care about what is around them, not what is far away?
You look at countries like the CFA franc zone, where a lot of the countries have their currencies linked to France and the euro, and you look at a lot of countries that are receiving foreign aid from the West. So the question is, how free are African countries? And I think even particularly France.
Like that's right. That's like right. The question of
French colonies.
The question of the independence of some African countries has come under debate frequently. Well, you see, independence should be understood from many perspectives. So total independence.
Yeah.
Would be difficult to actually quantify and define. But if we look at it from different perspectives, maybe political independence, then you say, okay, maybe to some degrees, like when the British left, they let you do your business. Even when you called them, they didn't answer. But when the French left, it tended from colonialism to another form, to neo-colonialism. They put in place structures where the new elite that came to govern the former French colonies actually depended on its survival from the French. They actually entered into agreement post-independence with the French to protect their power, and that's where the military accords came into place that have not yet been completely abrogated. There are still military accords in former French colonies that allow France to put its military bases in those countries, and I suspect that those military accords were to protect the power of this elite, because this elite knew that they didn't have the support of the masses behind them, so they needed an external power to form of legitimize their role, and we've seen that continue today in countries that have not have a smooth democratic transition, where elections are flawed, but there's nothing the masses can do because there's a foreign power that makes sure that the kleptocratic elite does not leave power.
So you mentioned a situation where the masses are not used to the educational system, and there are systems in place that sort of do not promote sort of mass movements.
That's why, yeah.
You say the elite is sort of being protected.
That's why.
What's the future? When are particularly Francophone African countries
so the future is in education. How do you create that critical mass? How do you bring up people to the state that they can think and agree on a common cause? Education has a greater role to play, and I'm happy that the international community, the United Nations systems, has been putting its emphasis on getting people, educating people, and even the United States government has recently been laid emphasis on how you build that civil society, organizations, give people education, train them to be liberal, more liberal in their mindset, and to learn to associate. This is what is not. I think this is what colonialism in some parts of Africa was very detrimental, because it made the African become the enemy of himself. The African was the enemy of himself through the slave trade. People became scared and worried. They never trusted one another, because you never knew who was going to sell you out to, that kind of stuff. So education would go a long way to promote common ideas, will go a long way to promote the idea that we all belong together, and you need to survive on the basis of what I do. So collective action will come through education. It's going to be a long process. It's not something that we should see in the next 5 years. A change is going to be generations of constant building until we get to that critical mass. That kind of critical mass you saw goes to in Egypt, that went out and stood on the streets for countless number of days until they got what they wanted. It takes time to build that.
Yeah. I think one of the issues people might have when they hear about people researching or going into colonialism is sort of like a blame shift.
That's right.
To what extent, I think, is the responsibility of African economies strictly on the shoulders of Africans themselves? And to what extent are we still blaming colonialism for lots of the problems that really
are not.
That's right.
Are really at the fault of the leaders today.
That's right. And I think, and this is where it's important to probably highlight some of the benefits of colonialism. Colonialism helped to foster urbanization in Africa. We should not forget that. Urbanization was one of the major products of colonialism. And with urbanization, we now agree that when you have large centers of knowledge, it becomes more easier to produce goods because we can exchange and learn new ideas, and we'll get closer to the technological frontier. So urbanization has been one of the major offshoots of colonialism. Also improvement in technology, because now diseases that used to kill people have been almost eradicated, by the advent of technology that the colonizers brought. Then there's also something, these ones have been highlighted more often, but what has not been particularly mentioned is the importance of the monetary arrangements that the French system brought, the French colonialism. This I'm still to find records where people have given credit to that. This is actually where we should give merit, that the French did put in place a very beneficial monetary system for its former colonies, which they have been using up to now, the CFA franc currency board. That has been a very important product of colonialism, and it has been beneficial because it has enabled these countries to maintain stable inflation, without which it's difficult to plan for the future. Now the responsibility is on African leaders to make sure that you open your barriers, you make markets free, you remove the non-tariff barriers, remove things like administrative bottleneck, red tape, and ensure corruption is brought underneath. These are the things that will make the benefits of having such an efficient monetary arrangement. You gain more by eliminating corruption, red tape, and all those non-tariff barriers that make it difficult for people to trade. So colonialism, French colonialism in particular, has been very, very important and instrumental by bringing in place an efficient and a trustworthy monetary system in the former French colonies.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.